Hey there, everyone. It's Mazzy here, and this is a eulogy of sorts for my friend Vernon, who passed away a week ago on September 4th, 2019. This is a week later, depending on when I post it, and I'm going to just share some stories, show some music, show some records. So if it's something that doesn't interest you, feel free to move on. I don't take any of this personally. There will be some snark because that's what I'm about, and that's what my friend Vernon was about, even more so than myself. And I'm talking to him about this in this way because Vernon was all about music. Vernon was all about records. My friendship, my long friendship of 45 years, was all connected to music and records for the most part. And we had quite a weaving on and off journey. Not really off, but just, we'd be close for years and we wouldn't be close. Obviously, he hired me when he was 19, but I'm going to share some music. I'm going to tell some stories. They'll probably start off related exactly to Vernon, but they may veer into different directions because this is all improvisational, nothing planned. Let me grab these records because it tells a lot of this story. Exposure. Is that too hot, too bright? Automatic. William Vernon McNamara, that's his name. William Vernon McNamara III, born in West Virginia. Family moved and he grew up in Richmond, Virginia. Went to Columbia University for several years, then transferred, went to University of Virginia in Richmond. Just shy of his graduation, one semester shy, he moved with the girl to California. And that's where I met him about a year later. He apparently sold records on his own, like independently at both Columbia and at University of Richmond, or Virginia, I guess it's called. And he ended up working in San Francisco at a record factory. Now, this goes back into my story as well as his story, because this is about the connection of music we had. And I know it's been pointed out several times, including recently, that I always go back and, back in my day when I worked in a record store in 1975, when you get older, you tell stories, you remember things. Just think of this, think of it this way. Look back when you were 15, 16 to 25, 26, depending on how old you are now. And if you're within that period now, believe me, own those years, enjoy those years, because you will remember them for the rest of your life. You'll make friends that hopefully will last a lifetime. You'll fall in love or have relationships. You'll get dumped. You'll get hurt. This is kind of a lecture thing. About 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, I turned 65 years old. Not bad. I think I can go into a bar and pass for 64 now, but because I just have that good DNA, that skin. But you actually remember these things, and these things make you or contribute to who you are today. And I know there's a lot of a handful of VC members here, vinyl community members who are older than myself and have memories and understand what I'm talking about. People my age, some of you you boys and girls in your 40s, 50s, 20s, 30s that think, oh God, I'm getting so old and everything. And now I sound like, get off my lawn, you old motherfucker. Whippersnapper, sorry, that was, I can still have a potty mouth at my age. But this goes back, this all kind of goes into a pot or in a hat. And those years formed where I am and who I am today. And a lot of that has to do with my friendship with Vernon. William Vernon McNamara III is Vernon. When I was 19, I had been working just for a year in another record store, a big California chain, which I hated their politics. They were more the corporate structure thing. They were called the Warehouse, W-H-E-R-E. But hey, I wanted to work in a record store. I had been working in high school in a 4-4 plan my last 2 years of high school. I think Tuesdays and Thursdays I'd go downtown, and I was actually working in a law firm, and my parents got all excited. I was going to be some Jewish lawyer at some point. But of course I quit it to get a job in a record store, because from early on I was into music and records, from the Beatles, the Kinks, the Byrds, and so many other bands and artists. It was my life. It's all that's all I cared about on one level. It wasn't my only thing. So I quit that job because after a year, three of us, we were asking for a raise. We got a nickel an hour raise after a year. So three of us walked out. One of my friends got a job the following Monday at Columbus and Bay Tower Records in San Francisco. Another guy, I have no idea where he went. He's probably still unemployed. And I went to see this guy at the Record Factory, which was a small chain then of about maybe 7 stores in the Bay Area, mostly based in San Francisco. I think he had 3 stores there. And he had come into the store I worked and said, well, if you ever want a job, let me know. So, of course, this was the time. I went to see him. He told me to go over to the Record Factory on Irving Street, which is near Golden Gate Park in the Sunset District of San Francisco, to talk to Vernon. I went in there. I think Vernon was a little suspicious that they sent this guy that they thought he had to hire. And he talked to me about music, and he asked me, I don't think we even had resumes in those days for record stores. Just talked to you, wanted to size you up. And I was 19 years old. He was about 3 years older than me, so he would have been 21, 22. And I said a list of bands: Beatles, Kinks, rock and roll, British Invasion. All of a sudden I said country rock. Later country rock with the Eagles and the whole 70s thing was a big deal, but this was still that transition period, I guess. I mean, there was the folk singer-songwriter, James Taylor, Carole King, all that crap. Not crap, but you know what I'm talking about. But I told him I loved Sweetheart of the Rodeo, the Byrds album, one of my favorite albums. So he stopped right there. And he goes, well, do you know much about the music on that album? And I said, well, I know, from reading the liner notes about the people on it. And there's a guy, Graham Parsons, and I mentioned I learned about the Louvin brothers a little bit, but I didn't really know a lot about them. And I said also there's an album that same year that came out in 73, the year he hired me, by Graham Parsons, Grievous Angel, and I love that record. He stopped me and he said, well, when can you start? And he hired me right off the bat. So these 2 albums got me my job because of my interest in country rock. This was actually, I guess it was called country rock then, but it was way before Americana. It was a fusion of folk and rock and roll and country music. Graham Parsons really kind of pioneered that with the Byrds on this album. And all of you who know music know this album, at least you should. And even if I remember at the time it wasn't a hip thing. In fact, this record pretty much bombed at the time, as did this. And this record came out just after Graham Parsons died, and he was burned at Joshua Tree. And this was his first album. Well, also unbeknownst to me, and for some reason I didn't pay attention, that on both these records there's a beautiful, angelic harmony that wasn't mixed in the background, but as you know, was always up in front on these 2 records, and that's a woman, and it's Emmylou Harris. Even though it says her friggin' name right there, for some reason I don't think I paid attention or made the connection. And the following year in 75, when I was working with Vernon, at one point we got a box of promos in from the Warner Brothers rep, or he came by actually, and Vernon says, can I get another one of, he pointed to a record, he pulled it and he gave it to me. When you worked in record stores, I was lower on the ladder at that point. The hand-me-down promos, the primo stuff goes to the manager, assistant manager. and then it goes from there. Same with tickets to concerts and venues and shows. And he got me a copy of this record, Pieces of the Sky, Emmylou Harris, her first solo album on Reprise Records. And I fell in love with it. I did not realize initially who this woman was until Vernon told me that she's the voice on those Graham Parsons records you love. So this is my copy. Very wonderful record, important to me. And we went to see the Hot Band on their first tour. We got promo tickets at a club called the Boarding House in San Francisco, very small club. And I was able to see Emmylou with the Hot Band, and that was Rodney Crowell was in that band, and James Burton. And James Burton on his pink paisley guitar, which he had there, he had played earlier, I guess in the late 60s, early 70s, he played with Elvis Presley, but then he's on this album. In fact, you hear Graham scream out in one song, Tim Burton and his pink paisley guitar. So Vernon and I just, would always play and talk about Graham Parsons and obviously all the related bands to Graham Parsons, Flying Burrito Brothers, and so on. I just showed this actually on a whack-a-mole because we talked about nudie suits, and this was with Chris Hillman from the Byrds, and it's just an incestuous group of artists at the time. And this paralleled my friendship and my education of music and with Vernon. He also started going back, and he's turned me on to more roots and bluegrass music, one of which was Bill Monroe, one of the great bluegrass players of all time, maybe the inventor of bluegrass, possibly, probably, at least brought it out to the outside of, the small, where, it came out in the South. And also, even though I had known of them, I never had a Louvin Brothers record. This is a reissue that's way out of print, I believe, by Light in the Attic. If you can find this record, maybe it is available still. It's a perfect record, gorgeous record. Any Louvin Brothers records you should get if you like this kind of roots music. But I got into this music because of Vernon, and I learned about all kinds of music because of Vernon. I mean, he wasn't so much into jazz, but I started buying jazz for the store a little bit, and I started buying country music occasionally, and I started looking at these records and listening to the records that were played in the store, and it was an amazing, amazing, wonderful time. Now, Vernon was hysterical. You think I'm snarky and I go for the cheap joke and the one-liners and the innuendos, and I go for the well, I try to be funny. Actually, I don't try. It comes naturally. I know some of you love it. Some, it's okay to turn a channel. I'm never offended by that. Self-deprecation is high on my list here. But Vernon was hysterical. He was smart, really smart. Knew history. I think he was the first person. I remember at one point something pissed me off. And it wasn't like I was really mad, but you have friends and you piss them off. And all of a sudden I yelled out and I said, "You fucking cracker." Well, I don't think I realized, being a Westerner, I didn't realize what that meant. He actually really played it out. And I think I learned this from him too, because I don't know if you've seen a couple of videos where I can go for the reaction and the emotion of being hurt and offended. I can't do it right now, but he basically had this straight ahead look. I get a smirk and I bust myself all the time, but he kept a straight face. And I think someone said to me, "Do you realize what you just said to Vernon? You called him a cracker. You know what that means? You know the connotations of that?" And this is in the early 70s. Not that it's changed any, but anyway, need I say more? So I haven't used that term again, but maybe now with all my new Southern friends, maybe I'll bring it back in. I kid. Okay, sorry, just joking. I saw a lot of music with him, and I was going to show some records and maybe pull some things out, and I don't even know where this is going, and I think this is going to go on for a long time because this is something. This is like self-therapeutic. I need to get this stuff out. I need to express my love and friendship for this man who, really nurtured me along early on. After a couple years, I think he was a manager of the store for, maybe just 2.5, 3 years when I worked for him. I was in college at San Francisco State, so I was working and going to school in the film and broadcasting department at San Francisco State. Mostly anyway. And I lived at the block, and I worked with Vernon and a number of other people. Again, went to so many shows. We got free tickets to shows. I went with Vernon to see Merle Haggard, Willie Nelson. That's only on the countryside. We went to see the boarding house, that little club, the first, I guess it was 76 by that point, maybe 77, the Talking Heads, Patti Smith, the Wailers, in clubs, small clubs. This is not bragging, saying, well, I saw this person, but it's true. That was a time where these people were playing in clubs. You could see these bands, you could turn on these bands. Not everyone was great. We went to Winterland a lot in the early days, in those mid 70s, from 74 to 78, I guess it was, until Winterland closed. I do remember one time that there was tickets that were announced to see the band were going to perform a show at Winterland, and they were going to supposedly call it quits, and there's going to be a bunch of guest stars, and it was going to be in 1976 at Winterland, and it was going to be on Thanksgiving Day in 76, and tickets were $25. Three of my buddies and I bought tickets, and that was $25 was a lot of money then. Think of it, you're getting less than $3 an hour. So, but it did include Thanksgiving dinner, Winterland. And that's where they started. Then it became, I don't remember all in what order, but they called it the Last Waltz, as obviously we all know historically now. And Vernon decided that was too much for rock and roll. He wasn't going to buy a ticket. And we all actually thought about it. And looking back on, years later, Vernon wishes he had gone and bought a ticket. But I totally get where he was coming from at the time, and he held to his principles about $25 for a rock show. Of course, it wasn't just any rock show, and it was, as you know, Muddy Waters and Van Morrison and Eric Clapton and Joni Mitchell and Neil Young and on and on and on. Ronnie Hawkins and the band, of course, and obviously the movie Martin Scorsese made and the soundtrack that came out 2 years later in 78. But I remember that moment too, and I remember that afternoon of that show. I was working because we were open on Thanksgiving. We were open on Thanksgiving Day. Record stores were open every day in those days. And I remember the last record I played, we closed it early. I think we closed it at 5 o'clock or something. And I played this Warren Zevon album as the last album. It's funny how certain things you just remember that moment. And again, this is my very favorite Warren Zevon album. And this is one of those albums that brings a lot of memories. Hastening Down the Wind, The French Inhaler, Desperados Under the Eve. Probably one of the greatest albums written about, in a way, the dark side of Los Angeles, in my opinion. Just a beautiful record, even though it's not all overtly about Los Angeles. There are a few songs, Carmelita, I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, Mohammed's Radio. Again, Vernon got us tickets to see Warren Zevon. Again, this was on Asylum Records, and when that album came out, in those days when an album came out by an artist, Warner Brothers, Columbia Records, the major labels, Atlantic, WEA basically, or Columbia, or even MCA, we'd get tickets and there'd be buzz. I mean, we were really fortunate enough, you know, to see Cheap Trick. Cheap Trick, we didn't know what Cheap Trick was. And Columbia had they call it a showcase. And we went to a lot of showcase performances. There's a little club called the Old Waldorf that Bill Graham ended up taking over. And later, did he call it Wolfgang's, or that was the other club? Okay, well, the Old Waldorf up on Battery Street, and there were shows there. And U2 was one of the shows we saw at a little club. This was again a little later. And Cheap Trick, and I remember the guy in front of me had all this hair. He was a tall guy in hair, and I kind of had to move up. I was kind of in an angle to the stage, and a couple times he finally turned around, and it was Brian May from Queen. Queen had been playing in town, or had just played, or was playing that night or the night before, and went to the showcase. I guess he heard the buzz. But that was a time when you would hear the buzzes of these artists, and you know, Cheap Trick, they were fun. Didn't blow me away at the time, but looking back on it, you can say, oh man, I saw Cheap Trick in a club, or I saw U2 in a club, or Elvis Costello was another one. And a lot of these things were, I remember Vernon would fight to get tickets for his crew, his posse, his employees. Then Vernon, again after 3 years or so, Vernon and his, it was like a yo-yo. We went back and forth. Him and his girlfriend, he quit the record factory, quit his job. I was assistant manager, then I became manager. I don't remember exactly the order of it. But then Vernon went to Europe for 6 months, maybe it was 3 months. But him and his girlfriend went to Europe and kind of went off and did their excursion. And then Vernon came back without his girlfriend, and apparently they broke up some point during that. And I don't remember all the details, but that's not for me to share anyway, right? But I had a roommate, Brooks. You've seen Brooks in those Jazz Shit Boys videos. That was my roommate, Brooks. Brooks also worked with us at the record factory, and Brooks and I were in the broadcasting department at San Francisco State, into communications and so on. So Brooks and I were big fans of music, and he's the one that turned me on to jazz. See, all these things interconnect. But Vernon came back, and slept on our couch for, I think, 2 months while he's looking for an apartment, looking for a job. Meanwhile, the record factory transfers me out to manage a larger store in the fucking suburbs, which I hated. But I worked there probably a year. Vernon comes back. He's trying to get a record gig at a label. So I hire Vernon to work in the store I was with. So it was like a yin-yang thing. He only worked there for about 6 months with me, maybe not even that. Then he got a job at Polygram Records. So Vernon went on to work for Polygram Records, and that's in those days where he used to give me all those promos. And they were basically Donna Summer, Casablanca, all the disco crap, all the Georgia Moroder records, the disco crap, all the Kiss records. I remember getting the complete set and posters of those Kiss solo records. You know, they had the exact same cover, but 4 of them. You guys know this. I mean, Melinda, you know this. You know what I'm talking about if you're still hanging in here watching this. I just never got into Kiss, and Vernon gave us tickets, so we all went to see Kiss. It was hysterical, but just wasn't my thing. But I still glad I saw Kiss. I went with Vernon because we got tickets to see the Bay City Rollers because our buddy at Arista. You remember the Bay City Rollers? All that plaid. It was 2 shows, and it was an afternoon, like a 4 o'clock matinee at the Berkeley Community Theater, with all these young girls wearing plaid and holding up this scarves, the Scottish scarves for the Bay City Rollers. I'm going to go back a couple years to this album. I showed this on one of my videos. Genevieve Waite. Talk about, what, cheesecake, right? Beefcake, cheese? No, this would be cheesecake. Photographed by Richard Avedon, the great Richard Avedon. Genevieve Waite was an ingenue singer, theatrical artist that was married for a while to John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas. John Phillips produced this album. I'm going back now to 1974. We got this album in, and I did play it, and I don't think I'll play it on here unless I do some overdubbing, which I rarely do here, as you know. but she has this high voice, very retro style, classic kind of, 30s, 40s sound. And for some reason, it surprised the shit out of me, this album, Vernon fell in love with. And then he gave me a promo copy, and I kind of fell in love with it. It got to almost like this is one of those records in the Record Factory store that got to be a bit of a running joke, because we would put it on, and I remember it would drive there's a guy named Skip who worked with us, long red hair with a ponytail, and every time we put this on, he almost wanted to throw like a fucking something at the turntable and knock it over. Because remember, we were playing actual records in stores in those days. And sometimes he would literally go and just take it off, and you hear the scratch of the needle across it. Sometimes, though, we decided we'd put this on when we were closing because it was a good way to get rid of people in the store. It's not that bad. It's funny. It's hysterical. I just played it recently, about within the last 6 months, and again, it's on one of my earlier videos, and I can't remember in what context. But it just every time I see Romance is on the Rise, Genevieve Waite, it's like, Vernon, this is hysterical. I need to, in any eulogy this long, I need to include Graham Parsons, the Louvin brothers, the Byrds, Warren Zevon, Bill Monroe, Flying Burrito Brothers, and of course, Genevieve Waite. Vernon was also would always promote this one band. I mean, after he worked for Polygram, after he worked for Polygram, over the last, he got out of the record business, or they got out of him. The record business is going like this, and there's ageism and all that. About 10 years ago is when he lost his last job in the record industry. He worked for Koch Records that distributed a lot of labels. I would get promo CDs of things, including Collector's Choice and other labels. He sold a lot and promoted a lot of rap music, a lot of reissues, indie bands. He was also really into the whole New Orleans thing. And he turned me on to other records I showed here. Queen Ida, the whole Arhoolie record, Smithsonian Folkways, anything folk music, any roots music. Phil Oakes. I knew of Phil Oakes. He turned me even onto Phil Oakes even more so. I remember we went to see Tom Waits. There was, again, when his first or second, it was a Closing Time came out. Asylum Records had a launch party out at the Beach Chalet, which is on the Great Highway in San Francisco, below the Cliff House. And it was literally a place, there was about 75 people in these chairs. And all there was is a piano and a palm tree. And Tom Waits played on his piano and sang, and that was it. That's when he was actually fully realized songs like, obviously, Old 55, that he probably made more money on that song than any other song he ever wrote because of the Eagles. Good for him. But Vernon got us into passes to see Tom Waits. Again, I go round and round and round, and where it stops, nobody knows. We spin it all and everything. But again, Queen Ida and Clifton Chenier. Vernon would go every year for about 10, 15 years or so. He'd go every year to New Orleans, to Jazz Fest. And I hate to admit it, to this day, I've never been to New Orleans. And Michelle is the mother of my child. We're very, very close friends now. We never got married, but we have a wonderful son. We're really good friends. That's our kind of, I see her all the time. She's up here. She's got a ranch, actually, just 2 to 3 hours away, depending on the ferry service. And Michelle and I were going to go with Vernon and a bunch of people to New Orleans to Jazz Fest in, I guess it was 1990. We had our tickets, everything was planned, and then Michelle gets pregnant, and she gets a little sick, and we didn't go. Hey, the good news is we have a wonderful son, Joseph, that was born the end of 1990. Wonderful, wonderful son. You've seen him in one of my whack-a-moles. He was here. Great sense of humor. He's the better version of the both of us mixed up and mixed together. So we didn't go that year. We had to cancel our trip. And it just never worked out. And Vernon and I were going to go, and Vernon kept going year after year. And, you raise a kid. You guys who have young and women who have young children know, your life does sort of change for a while. And there's things you don't have the freedom. And that's fine to do like you used to do it. Now, sure, you can drag your family and kids to certain things, and people do, and we did with Joseph all the time. I used to take Joseph to music, to the film all the time, because it was all ages. I basically brainwashed him to turn him on to music. And then, obviously, he discovered who he wanted to discover, and some of those bands and artists I turned him on to, he connected with, and some he didn't. But Vernon and I never really hooked up in terms of getting all of us together to go to Jazz Fest, but he was so into that music. Beausoleil, if you ever heard of Beausoleil, he kind of worked with those guys a little bit, doing a little bit of promotion, did a little bit of marketing, that whole New Orleans sound, and I went to see them several times with Vernon as he came. Vernon was the friend I went to probably see more Ry Cooder shows with. Here, those of you who watch us regularly, and if you've gotten this far, my guess is this is really interesting to you, or I'm not totally boring you, or you've watched enough to know about my musical taste and things, but Ry Cooder is my favorite guitar player. And back in '76, I went to all 4 shows he did at the Great American Music Hall that turned into the live record he did in '76 or '77. And did 2 shows at night, and I went to all 4. Vernon was there for one of the nights. Years later, when Ry Cooder did another Great American Music Hall concert in San Francisco, that turned into the live record on, let's see here. Might as well do some show and tell here, right? This beautiful, gorgeous live record on Non-Such, Vernon and I went to that concert. And we stood in the back the whole time, right next to the soundboard, because it's not a gigantic club. And right on the soundboard, this is kind of cool. We you remember specific things. Right on next to the sound engineer, the sound man, was a folding chair. And in that folding chair sat Linda Ronstadt. And she was just transfixed with... by Ry's show, and as you know, they played on each other's records over the years, sang, and Ry's performed. In fact, this new documentary that's I haven't seen it yet. It's supposed to be fabulous. That just came out of Linda Ronstadt. Ry Cooder is in that as well. But Vernon and I went to this show together, and then about a year before I left San Francisco and moved to Seattle, which is 5.5 years ago. So about 6 years ago. Ry Cooder did a really special small show at a Union Hall on the Embarcadero, San Francisco, very close to the Giants baseball stadium. Union Hall maybe holds 100 people, folding chairs. It's exactly what you'd expect a Union Hall to look like. Ry Cooder did a benefit for the Union, and it was with Joaquin, his son, and a bass player. And Vernon and I went to that show, and that's when... That's when Election Special came out, around that time. And I actually bought this record there and got it signed by, so this was 2012. 2012, signed by Ry Cooder and Joaquin Cooder. And it really emulated the whole thing of Labor Fest, which is the whole anniversary of the big union strike. There was a big union strike in San Francisco. The longshoremen struck at the, it was at the 1920s, and there were riots, and the teens or 20s in San Francisco, probably the 20s. And of course, Ry Cooder really supports the working man, very much like the whole Woody Guthrie, Billy Bragg sort of thing. So every time I hear Ry Cooder, it reminds me of my friend Vernon. But we were able to see that show with Rye, the small group. We were able to meet Rye, talk to him a little bit before the show, about music, about other shows we had seen, about Randy. We talked about Randy Newman. Actually, there's a great video. You can probably see a lot of it online. I found a copy of it recently, but it's really hard to find. But it's a good little intimate show. It's Randy Newman at the Odeon, which is a restaurant that's still in Manhattan, and it's Randy Newman on piano, and then it has Linda Ronstadt and Ry Cooder. Not on, a lot of it's solo. Randy Newman, Ry Cooder plays and sings a little bit with him, and as does Linda Ronstadt. It's one of my favorite performances of those three together. I'm always hoping, to this day still, I wish Randy and Ry would do an album together. I think they're at the perfect time in their life where some of Randy's songwriting and vocals could really work with Ry's guitar playing and his vocals and arrangements too. May never happen, but it's kind of a wish list. And all this relates, again, to my friend Vernon. He loved the songwriters like Randy Newman. He liked the left to center. He wasn't a heavy metal fan. To be honest with you, either am I. You know, if you call Led Zeppelin heavy metal, I don't really. I'm not a heavy metal fan. Interesting thing is when I got into the whole punk scene and new wave, especially punk bands, Vernon didn't get into that. My friend Brooks and I would go to all these shows in San Francisco. We'd go to the Mabuhay to see the Dead Kennedys, and the Damned would come through, and the Cramps, and the British bands, X, the LA bands. I'd go down to Madame Wong's and see some bands there in Los Angeles. Vernon never kind of really latched on to that stuff. He was into the Talking Heads. He got into Blondie a bit, that type of thing. And he just kept with the roots music for a long time. But he'd go see music all the time. He'd go every year up and, while he could until he got sick the last few years. In San Francisco, there's a wonderful festival. So far, it's still free, at least for the next few years, called Hardly Strictly Bluegrass. And it's a festival that's free in Golden Gate Park, and they're multi-stages. And it's exactly like the name sounds, Hardly Strictly. So its roots are in country and bluegrass, Emmylou Harris, the Bill Monroe type of things, Alison Krauss type things. But then you get into T-Bone Burnett, you get into Elvis Costello, you get into some of the Wilco and the whole Americana-related thing. You get the Austin artists. Vernon was very into that. He knew all those people. Vernon knew everyone. Everyone in the record business, retail, and that whole thing knew Vernon, and he would get passes and go backstage and be into. Whenever I went with Vernon, he introduced me to promoters and reps and writers and producers and artists, and he was just not pontificating his whole aura or anything. He was just a normal guy that loved music, and a true friend. So much music. So many musical memories I have with my friend. Another one I remember was going to a show in Berkeley, California. There was a club called The Stone, and Vernon and I had, and somebody else, I forgot who else, but that doesn't matter to you, does it? We went to the Berkeley Stone to see Gene Clark. Gene Clark was the original member of the Byrds. He had written a lot of their great early songs, including singles, and sang lead vocalists. He's the one with the many Beatle haircuts with the tambourine on the old footage, and he left early on. I can't remember if it's the fourth album or third album or fifth album, whatever. But Gene Clark went on to make a ton of other albums in the folk and folk rock arena for years to come. But Vernon was a big fan of Gene Clark. Obviously, I was a fan of Gene Clark because of the Byrds, because of being such a big Byrds fan. But Vernon had turned me on as I said many times already, the bluegrass and roots music. They turned on to the Dillards, Doug Dillard, Byron Berline, or Berlin, depending on your preference. And all these people were people that it kind of merged into that overlap with the Burrito Brothers and the whole, Clarence White, who became a member of the Byrds in the last half of the Byrds, great guitar player, was someone else that Vernon turned me on to Clarence White and his wonderful guitar picking, especially in songs like Chestnut Mare. In fact, you can find an old clip, go way, way back on YouTube and search at The Andy Griffith Show, and you can see the White brothers, including a young Clarence White, doing a bluegrass thing in one of the jail scenes with Andy Griffith on The Andy Griffith Show. But the Dillards were what was music that Vernon would play in the store and turn me on to. In fact, we used to have a sign-out sheet at the record factory where we could sign out. I think there was initially a limit of how many records we could sign out, but the list went on literally to 100 or more for each person. And we sign out the record, we'd have to either bring the record eventually back or something of equal value to replace it. So there was a term in the record business and retail business called cleans, which means a clean was a record that wasn't a cutout, it wasn't a promo copy, it wasn't marked or clipped anyway, and you could go find clean. So you go to a used record shop, and which were totally separate in those days than a new record shop, and you could, or records that you had that you didn't want anymore, as long as it's currently in print, you could bring it back and exchange it. So there was a whole creative bookkeeping with cleans and checking records out. But Vernon made me check out the Dillards albums, but he made me check out these two albums at the time. Dillard and Clark, The Fantastic Expedition of Dillard and Clark, and Through the Morning, Through the Night, Dillard and Clark. And this was Doug Dillard and Gene Clark, who did these two kind of country albums that became really cult albums. Obviously now with the whole Americana explosion of the last 10 to 20 years, these have been big cult albums. And it's really interesting how Gene Clark has become this amazing cult artist with a lot of his music being re-released. This is Roadmaster. This is an A&M, I believe it's a Canadian comp, that came out. A bunch of his songs released and unreleased, mainly unreleased too. He did a series of folk albums too at the time, very introspective, and this album has become a cult classic as well. Gene Clark record, beautiful record. And again, a lot of the same kind of overlapping folk rock artists. Gene Clark with the Gosden Brothers. This was an earlier solo he did after leaving the Byrds on Columbia Records. You can see that. But Vernon and I went to see another collector's edition, early LA sessions. A lot of this stuff, some of you've seen on those Bird Parts collections. Here Tonight, the White Light demos. And this was a recent reissue that came out, or unreleased tracks and things. But probably the one that's become one of the pretty much the biggest of the cult albums by Gene Clark is No Other. And No Other came out of nowhere. It bombed like all the rest. Vernon and I saw him play a few years after this. This was 1974, and the interesting thing of this, there's a lot of strange, I don't want to say goings on, but it's not the purely folk thing. It's almost like his glammed up period, but it's become a big cult record that's more electronic. I don't want to say it's glam because it's not glam country, but it is a little more electric and more adventurous than all his straight folk records at the time. But Gene Clark is someone that'll always remind me of my friendship, my musical friendship with Vernon as well. So Gene Clark is very special. I think the only other artist that I associate my time back in the record factory, and Vernon really turning me on to in a big way to him is Bruce Springsteen. Mainly this record. This came out in fact, his first two records both came out in 1973. And I never got this record at the time. I got it later once Born to Run came out, or actually once this album came out. But Vernon used to play this record in the store all the time. And obviously a lot of people in the day really were turned on to Incident on 57th Street and Rosalita. And it's funny, Rosalita I didn't grab onto until 1975 and the Born to Run tour. But the song on this that I gravitated to at the time, and maybe because it was more melodic, more just a beautiful, beautiful song in my opinion, was 4th of July, Asbury Park, otherwise known as Sandy. And I remember hearing around that exact time, in fact I might have even heard before I heard this version, is the Hollies recording this song of Sandy by Bruce Springsteen. But this and this I got because they were played in the store all the time, and I got into them, but then I especially got into this album. This album was a little more Dylan-esque on steroids a little bit, and it didn't have the epic. I mean, I don't have to tell you about Bruce Springsteen, you know? Digital Gramophone can tell you about Bruce Springsteen, John, and you know, I am a big fan, but it was when this album came out, Born to Run in 75, kind of his make or break album, and I'm not going to get into the whole story of Bruce Springsteen. That's not what this is about. But when this album came out, and I don't know if we scored him from Columbia, but Vernon got tickets, and four of us drove up to Sacramento, California, and we saw the first time I ever saw Bruce Springsteen. I think it was October of 75, but it's around that. It was in the fall of that year. And it was later on that the whole Born to Run tour, and it had been building up, and you know, Time and Newsweek covers and all the hype, the John Landau, I've seen the future of rock and roll, and it is Bruce Springsteen. Kind of over the top. How can anyone live up to that? But we went to Sacramento, we saw him, and I was, as I said many times, I was gobsmacked. It was one of the most intense, wonderful, beautiful, just energetic rock and roll experiences I had ever seen. And we drove up to Sacramento that night. We drove back like overnight, so we probably got home, you know, 3, 4 in the morning or so. We probably stopped for a bite. I don't remember all the details. The next night, we saw him in Oakland at the Paramount Theater. And so 2 nights in a row, Bruce Springsteen, Born to Run 1975. And then again, I went in 76 and on and on. And so I attribute Vernon to the person that really introduced me and made me understand at the time Bruce Springsteen. Because, you know, as big as he was, for a lot of people, I had a girlfriend. Here's a good story. I think in 70s, was it the At Show or in 76? Well, anyway, one of the shows, I went to the Paramount. I brought my girlfriend and another friend of mine. So the three of us were at the Springsteen show. And halfway through the show, my girlfriend and my buddy went out and sat in the lobby for the second half of the show. They just didn't get it. Years later, and that girlfriend is still a good friend of mine. I just saw her last week. We hung out after I went back to San Francisco because she knew Vernon pretty well too. And we reminisced about that time. She's a super Springsteen fan, had been for years now. She saw him in at the New York, the Bruce on Broadway thing. But anyway, Bruce Springsteen and Gene Clark, 2 other artists that will always, in my mind, in my eyes, be musicians and record makers that Vernon really kind of pushed me into. So I'm not really sure what else to say about Vernon. I keep thinking of, I just want to pull records and talk about Vernon for hours and hours. You know, we put things on and talk about music and see music together. You know, he did like the San Francisco bands. He did like, you know, like Jefferson Airplane. I wouldn't say he was a Deadhead. I don't think I ever went to a Dead show with Vernon. You know, I don't think I ever, not sure I ever went to see jazz at the Keystone Corner with Vernon. Brooks was my buddy for that. I miss the guy, but he's been sick for a while now. So, you know, people say, well, you're in a better place. Maybe. I don't know that. But I'm glad he's not sick anymore. I'm glad he's not suffering. I hope he can still listen to music. I hope he does. So Vernon, William Vernon McNamara III. I miss you, buddy. Thanks for Graham Parsons. Thanks for roots music. Thanks for all music. Thanks for your sense of humor, and thanks for being a drinking buddy. And thanks for being in my life. I love you.